Hi guys. Tonight we slip quietly through velvet curtains, the kind that sag heavy with incense, smoke and secrets. The Vatican glows around you, candles sputtering against marble walls, the faint hum of chanting from chapels. And yet, here in the hush behind closed doors, there's another rhythm entirely. You're not meant to be here, not among these chambers of red silk and hushed laughter. Still, you wander in, one step at a time, until you realize what's unfolding. The medieval papacy's strangest, most scandalous obsessions. And trust me, you probably won't survive this one without shaking your head at least once. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see who's listening from where. Now, dim the lights. You find yourself drifting down corridors hung with tapestries depicting saints. But behind those woven holy images, reality thrums with a much stranger pulse. The luxury of the papal palace wasn't just spiritual grandeur. It was velvet and satin, perfumes and rare spices, treasures that stirred every sense. Popes in the Middle Ages lived not as ascetics but as monarchs, and monarchs, of course, had appetites. That contrast, the lofty sermons in St. Peter's versus the whispered pleasures after sundown, makes the air here heavy with irony. The mainstream fact that grounds you is this. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the papacy had become one of the most opulent courts in Europe, rivaling the wealth of kings. Rome itself was rebuilt through papal taxes, indulgences and rents, and the popes at its helm often spent as freely on private chambers as on basilicas. The imagery of Christ's vicar on earth was wrapped, paradoxically, in silks imported from the East. But as you push open a carved wooden door, you stumble into something less discussed. A room arranged with low couches, velvet cushions, and trays of figs drizzled with honey. You can almost smell the ferment of wine, the musk of overused incense, the faint sweetness of dried roses scattered across the floor. This is no prayer chamber. This is a stage for what chroniclers later whispered about, that certain pontiffs turned their residence into theatres of sensual play. A quirky tidbit emerges here, one you'd barely believe. Some accounts claim Pope John XII, in the 10th century, transformed the Lateran Palace into what observers called a brothel. He allegedly toasted to the devil, gambled and entertained women and men alike. Whether exaggerated or not, the idea of the Lateran, officially the papal cathedral, being imagined as a house of vice-struck contemporaries as both hilarious and horrifying. It was the kind of gossip that gave enemies of Rome ammunition for centuries. You pause to notice how even the furniture seems to conspire in secrecy. Heavy curtains muffled sound. Hidden passageways allowed exits if scandal threatened. The Vatican wasn't built with transparent walls. It was a labyrinth, perfect for moving unseen between solemn altar and secret chamber. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the clink of a goblet being set down in the next room, followed by a laugh too warm to belong to prayer. And yet you reflect, the truth is always more layered. Scholars still argue whether medieval papal scandals were exaggerated by enemies, especially reformers, eager to smear Rome, or whether the chronicles preserve at least fragments of reality. The tension lies in that uncertain space. Did popes truly orchestrate orgiastic nights, or were satirical poets simply weaponizing rumor? You never quite know, and the ambiguity itself feels like part of the velvet curtain, hiding and revealing in equal measure. The strange paradox of these chambers is that they were designed to project sanctity but ended up fueling the imagination of critics. As you trail your fingers along a cold marble pillar, you can almost picture the candlelight flickering against painted saints on the walls, while just beneath, cardinals and courtiers whispered about the Pope's latest guests. Rome was a city alive with contradiction, pilgrims streaming in by day, sin thriving by night. Your ears fill with echoes, the choir outside, rising in solemn Latin, and beneath it, muffled laughter, like two overlapping soundtracks you're not supposed to play together. The effect is dizzying, almost theatrical, and you begin to realize this wasn't just hypocrisy, it was survival. Popes were politicians, monarchs, spiritual figureheads. Their private indulgences weren't merely about lust, they were about power, patronage, and the careful weaving of alliances through pleasure. As you settle deeper into the couch of this imagined chamber, the weight of it presses against you. The air feels close, heavy with incense and secrecy. You think about how many lives, how many whispered names, were shaped in spaces like this, never written down in official decrees, yet somehow more influential than any papal bull. The velvet curtains sway gently as if stirred by breath itself, and you can't tell whether it's from the draft of a hidden corridor or the sigh of someone slipping quietly away. The night in Rome stretches on, and you find yourself drifting with it, lulled not by prayer but by scandal, carried forward into deeper and stranger corners of papal history. Our drift further, and suddenly the heavy velvet curtains give way to something harsher, the crisp edge of parchment, the scratch of quills, and the echo of words spoken from pulpits. You step into a chamber where the echo of celibacy vows lingers like a hollow promise. The marble floors gleam beneath your feet, but every polished surface seems to mirror a lie. Celibacy, after all, was not always the defining rule of the clergy. That's your grounding fact tonight. In the early medieval centuries, many priests, bishops, and even popes were married or openly partnered. The discipline of celibacy only hardened into law after the 11th century, when reforms under Pope Gregory VII insisted that priests renounce wives and children to preserve the purity of the Church. It sounded lofty, but by then the gap between law and practice had already become a chasm wide enough to swallow an empire. You notice the sound first, the careful cadence of Latin vows recited in vaulted chapels. Young clerics swore before altars never to marry, never to indulge. The air reeked of incense, holy oil, candle smoke. Yet if you slipped outside into Rome's taverns at midnight, you'd stumble across the same clerics with flushed faces, drinking too much wine, whispering to companions under the glow of torchlight. The theatre of celibacy wasn't designed to abolish desire. It was designed to stage, manage it. One quirky detail leaps out from the margins of history. Accounts tell of Pope Sergius III, in the early 10th century, whose name was tied to a notorious woman, Marozia, of the powerful Theophylact family. She was described in chronicles as his mistress, and their union supposedly produced a child who later became Pope John XI. Whether true or embroidered, the gossip suggests how little vows constrained ambition. Even chastity could be rewritten when politics required heirs. You press your hand against a carved wooden bench, and you feel the grooves worn by countless knees. Monks and priests bent in prayer here, asking forgiveness for failings everyone knew would be repeated. The contradiction is almost comical, if it weren't so tragic. By day, the Pope thundered about purity. By night, his chambers buzzed with visitors whose names were carefully left off the record. And yet, pause here. Historians remain divided over whether some of the worst tales were malicious exaggerations, penned by rival factions during the endless wars between emperors and popes. Was Pope Sergius truly the father of John XI? Or was that just a smear designed to make Rome look like a family soap opera? Scholars still dispute the details, shaking their heads over chronicles that read more like satire than sober record. The scent of hypocrisy grows thick in this room. You imagine parchment scrolls with Latin decrees, urging priests to live like angels, even as candlelight flickered over beds that told another story. Celibacy as theatre, that phrase lingers like smoke. The audience was the Christian faithful, watching a performance meant to uphold authority. Behind the curtains, though, the cast broke character. You might chuckle at the thought. Haven't you ever seen someone deliver a speech with conviction, only to contradict themselves hours later? The medieval church excelled at this duplicity, but it wasn't comedy to the people living under it. It was power. The vows of celibacy gave the papacy leverage, stripping priests of dynastic families, ensuring loyalty to Rome rather than to sons or daughters. It was less about purity and more about control. You can almost hear the sound of sandals on stone as young priests walked in solemn processions. their chants resonating through basilicas. Yet, after dark, the sound changed. Hurried footsteps, whispers, the scrape of a hidden door. You think of it as a double soundtrack again. The official hymn layered over the private sigh. Touch the cold wall beside you. It feels damp, as if absorbing centuries of contradiction. Imagine the texture of parchment rules, brittle yet sharp, scratching against the skin of reality. Smell the wax dripping from 1,000 candles lit in the name of chastity, and hear the laughter that cut across those vows like a knife through soft bread. It's strange, isn't it? How rules meant to elevate can sometimes make rebellion more delicious. Perhaps the very severity of the vow made the breaking of it irresistible, and so you linger here, watching the play unfold. The theatre of celibacy, where the actors never quite stay in costume, and the audience never really stops believing in the illusion. And as you lean back, the curtain sways again, leading you onward into the next chamber, where mistresses in scarlet gowns wait to step onto this ever-darkening stage. You follow the swaying curtain and step into a softer glow. The room smells faintly of rose oil and sweet almond, a perfume that clings to fabrics long after the women have gone. Here, the papal chambers no longer pretend to be about prayer at all. This is where concubines slip in through hidden passages, their footsteps muffled by carpets imported from the East. You sit quietly and watch the performance, because this was Rome in the Middle Ages, a stage where mistresses were treated like royal appointments. The grounding fact tonight is simple, though still shocking. Several medieval popes openly kept concubines. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, lived in the late 15th century and had a long-term mistress, Vannozza dei Catanei, with whom he fathered 4 children, including the infamous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. His papal court didn't even bother to hide it. His family became entangled in politics, marriages, and scandals across Europe. For him, mistresses weren't a guilty indulgence, they were part of the architecture of power. You picture the scene. Vannozza arrives at the Vatican not as a secret fling, but as a figure with her own estates, her own servants, her own dignity in the eyes of courtiers. Draped in rich fabrics, she would be seated at banquets alongside nobles who all knew her connection to the Pope. The atmosphere would thrum with the clink of goblets, the low murmur of flirtation, the soft pluck of a lute in the corner. You feel the texture of velvet under your fingertips, the warm buzz of spiced wine as it passes your lips, the slow hum of a court where concubinage was less scandal and more custom. Here's your quirky tidbit. Chroniclers claim Pope Julius II, the so-called warrior pope, fathered at least one illegitimate daughter named Felice. Yet what amused his critics was that he publicly railed against clerical concubinage while quietly indulging in it himself. Imagine a man in gleaming armor, charging into battle to defend church lands, then slipping home to spend the night with women whose existence the official record pretended not to notice. The hypocrisy itself became part of the theatre, one more ironic twist in a long line of contradictions. You lean closer, almost as if to eavesdrop on a whispered conversation. The women in these chambers weren't simply passive ornaments. They shaped alliances. They whispered secrets. They bore children whose marriages secured bonds with powerful noble houses. To call them mistresses misses the political weight they carried. Every kiss could be a treaty, every embrace a gamble with history. And yet, historians disagree on how much of this was normalized versus exaggerated. Some argue that accusations of papal mistresses were spread as propaganda, designed to undercut papal authority during times of schism and reform. Others point to baptismal records and land grants that quietly acknowledge papal children as proof that concubines weren't just rumor, they were flesh and blood presences shaping the church. The debate lingers like the scent of incense, never fully cleared. You listen to the room again. The rustle of silk skirts, the soft creak of a mattress under weight, the muffled laugh of someone trying not to be overheard. Outside, pilgrims shuffled through Rome's streets, convinced the Pope lived like a saint. Inside, the reality was as worldly as any palace. The candlelight flickers against the ceiling, painting shadows of intertwined figures across frescoed walls. You reach out to touch the carved arm of a chair, polished smooth by hands long gone. Perhaps a pope once sat here, Vannozza by his side, their fingers brushing while the court tried not to stare too obviously. And in this you realize concubines in cassocks weren't so much a contradiction as a continuation. If kings could rule with mistresses, why not popes? The Vatican was less a monastery than a monarchy, and monarchs rarely slept alone. The chamber grows warm with the scent of perfume and smoke, and as you close your eyes, the voices fade into one another, prayer and laughter, vows and betrayals blurring into the background hum of Rome itself. The air grows thicker as you walk further, and the muffled whispers sharpen into scandalous gossip. You hear the words Filii Papales, papal sons, spoken half in jest, half in envy. For while popes stood at the pulpit declaring themselves spiritual fathers to all Christendom, in their private chambers they were literal fathers to flesh and blood children. Your grounding fact here is blunt. By the late Middle Ages, the Vatican had acknowledged, sometimes quietly, sometimes quite openly, that certain popes had illegitimate offspring. The clearest example comes again from Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, whose children Cesare and Lucrezia were treated as pawns in European politics. Cesare was made a cardinal at 18, then shed the cassock to become a military commander. Lucrezia was married off in alliances that shifted the balance of power in Italy. These weren't hidden embarrassments, they were dynastic maneuvers in papal clothing. You feel it in the air of the palace, a strange double identity. By day, the Pope thundered against sin from marble pulpits. By night, he listened to the cries of newborns, tiny heirs who would one day carry his blood into the dangerous game of noble marriage. The atmosphere is weighted with both incense and cradle song, as though the Vatican itself couldn't decide whether it was a church or a royal nursery. A quirky tidbit drifts up from dusty chronicles. Pope Innocent VIII, in the late 15th century, is said to have openly acknowledged his children. Not only did he recognize them, he used papal resources to arrange wealthy marriages for them. One report even claims he was the first pope to allow his offspring to live openly within papal palaces. Imagine pilgrims entering Rome, expecting angelic chastity, only to glimpse toddlers darting through courtyards guarded by Swiss mercenaries. You lean close to hear the gossip more clearly. Some courtiers whispered blessings, others snickered. After all, if God's representative on earth could not resist fathering children, what hope was there for ordinary priests? But here's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that claims of papal bastards were inflated by enemies eager to discredit Rome, especially during the Protestant Reformation. Others note that records of papal grants and inheritances to specific children leave little doubt that these infants existed. Was every child truly the Pope's, or were some convenient scapegoats of rumor? The truth remains hazy, flickering like candlelight. The soundscape wraps around you. The cries of infants, the rustle of wet nurses tending them, the echo of court gossip in corridors. You smell milk and rosewater mixed together, strangely domestic against the cold marble of a papal palace. You imagine the weight of a baby placed in a pope's arms, the contrast between his white vestments and the wriggling pink skin of his heir. And as you run your hand along the polished balustrade, you sense how deeply these children changed history. Cesare Borgia's ruthless campaigns inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. Lucrezia Borgia's marriages wove alliances that shifted entire kingdoms. What began as private scandal ended up reshaping the political map of Europe. You might chuckle softly at the irony. The Church spent centuries debating whether priests should be allowed to marry to prevent scandal. Yet the highest priest of all was fathering dynasties that left scars across history. Hypocrisy didn't just exist here, it strutted openly, in velvet booties and wedding gowns. Still, you wonder, perhaps these children weren't mistakes but strategies. In a world where kings married daughters to secure borders, why wouldn't popes do the same? The Vatican was less about heaven and more about survival, and survival often needed heirs. As you step back, the sound of lullabies fades, replaced once more by laughter and the faint clink of goblets. The papal nursery dissolves into the glow of a new chamber, where long tables groan with roasted meats, amphorae of wine, and bodies draped across couches. A banquet of temptation awaits you now, louder and more dangerous than the cries of any infant. The moment you step across the threshold, the sound hits you first, goblets clinking, laughter spilling, and the strum of a lute that competes with the chatter of voices. The smell is overwhelming. Roasted boar, garlic, heavy sauces, cinnamon and cloves dusted over sweetmeats, wine so strong it burns the nostrils before the tongue. You've wandered into a papal banquet, though this is no simple supper. This is temptation staged as ritual, a feast where indulgence in food and flesh blended seamlessly. Here's the steady historical fact to anchor you. Medieval popes, especially in the Renaissance era, hosted lavish banquets that rivaled those of secular princes. Alexander VI, again infamous, threw feasts where cardinals, nobles, and foreign envoys dined until dawn, tables groaning under exotic fruits and gilded chalices. The Vatican kitchens employed entire armies of cooks, and the expense of these gatherings often drained papal coffers faster than wars. These events weren't simply meals, they were political theatre, opportunities to flaunt power and forge alliances. But then, the quirky detail peeks through the smoke. Chroniclers tell us of one especially lurid banquet in 1501, remembered as the Banquet of Chestnuts. According to later accounts, courtesans danced nude among scattered chestnuts, crawling on all fours while guests tossed nuts across the floor as though it were a grotesque game. Whether the story is embroidered or real, the image sticks monks and cardinals seated with goblets in hand, watching as flesh became entertainment. You can almost hear the chestnuts rolling across the stone, clattering like dice. Lean closer. Feel the waxy slickness of spiced wine spilling onto your fingers, the texture of oil-slick roasted meats that leave your lips greasy. The air is humid with sweat, perfume, and the acrid sting of smoke from torches burning too close to the tapestries. And in that thickness, you realize this wasn't just indulgence. Banquets blurred into orgiastic play. Guests drank until they collapsed. Alliances were whispered over pillows, and promises were sealed with touches under the table. Still, the question nags: how much of this was fact, and how much was satire crafted by enemies of Rome? Historians still debate whether the infamous chestnut banquet ever happened as described, or whether it was exaggerated propaganda circulated by reformers. Was it truth or grotesque cartoon? The uncertainty itself tells you something. These popes lived so extravagantly that people believed such wild tales could be true. The music swells, harps, drums, voices raised in bawdy song. You catch fragments of lyrics mocking chastity, jokes so coarse they make you grin even centuries later. You glance at the faces of guests, flushed with drink, eyes glazed with desire, hands moving restlessly as they wait for the spectacle to begin. Banquets weren't simply meals. They were rehearsals of power, carnality woven into politics. And if you touch the carved edge of the banquet table, you feel how sticky it is, as though drenched in honey and wine spilled across countless nights. The wood is scarred with knife marks, dents from goblets slammed too hard. The texture of centuries of indulgence. Smell the sweetness of figs, the salt of roasted fish, the musk of bodies pressed too close. You wonder aloud, was it the food or the company that intoxicated more? Perhaps it was both. The ritual of feasting allowed excess to become normal, even sacred. If kings ruled through banquets, why not popes? And so you sit back, the music rising and laughter swelling around you. The banquet stretches on endlessly, every sense assaulted, every vow of chastity drowned in goblets of wine. The night here doesn't end with prayer, it ends with whispers in corners, hands clutching at fabric, and the slow burn of scandal that seeps through Rome's streets the next morning. When you rise to leave, the chestnuts still clatter faintly across the floor behind you, a reminder of how temptation could be staged as spectacle. And ahead, through another curtain, you hear softer voices, courtesans, not dancers now, but strategists, weaving networks of influence that ran straight into the papal chambers. You slip away from the banquet's heat, following the faint perfume of jasmine and the hush of women's voices. The corridors twist like veins, until you emerge into a chamber, not crowded with revelry, but with soft laughter and calculated whispers. Here, courtesans reign not as dancers, but as silent diplomats. You realize quickly that this is no accident. These women were carefully placed near the papal court by powerful families, part of a network of seduction that greased the wheels of politics. The fact that steadies you. In 15th century Rome, noble houses often used courtesans as instruments of influence, ensuring proximity to cardinals, bishops, and even the Pope himself. The papal court wasn't just a holy office. It was a stage where alliances were made as much in bed as in council chambers. Chroniclers noted that many mistresses around the Vatican came from well-connected families who saw advantage in supplying beauty where power resided. You lean against the carved doorway and watch as a young woman in emerald silk adjusts her jeweled veil. She isn't simply here for companionship. Her uncle waits for her reports. Her brother seeks a benefice. Her family plots for lands and offices. Each glance across the chamber is a negotiation. Each smile a contract unspoken. Here's the quirky tidbit. Pope Sixtus IV, famous for commissioning the Sistine Chapel, also became infamous for a vast web of nepotism. His critics joked that he filled the Vatican with his nephews, but many of these so-called nephews were rumored to be sons born of liaisons, with women strategically placed at court. Even more curious, some sources claim that courtesans arranged introductions and even managed schedules like early papal secretaries, but with silk and perfume instead of ink and parchment. The room pulses with intrigue. You hear the rustle of fabrics, the low murmur of women rehearsing lines they'll deliver to their papal patrons later tonight. The smell is layered, rosewater mingled with amber resin, sweat masked beneath costly oils. You imagine the touch of embroidered velvet cushions, the softness at odds with the sharp edge of the schemes being plotted here. And yet, historians cannot quite agree on how much power these women truly held. Some argue they were pawns, pushed forward by families and discarded when their usefulness ended. Others suggest they were active players, skilled in manipulation, crafting careers not only for themselves but for their kin. The debate lingers like perfume, impossible to sweep away. You sit quietly in the corner, and you realize the paradox. The Church thundered against the sins of the flesh, but in practice it turned courtesans into unofficial diplomats. Beds became council chambers, whispers became treaties, and the fate of bishoprics could depend on who spent the night in which room. The music of the banquet still hums faintly behind you, but here the soundscape is different, subdued, sly, layered with knowing laughter. It feels colder, sharper, though the air is warm with incense. You reach out and feel the cold bite of a silver goblet on the table, abandoned half full of spiced wine, perhaps by a woman rushing off to meet a cardinal. You think of it as a spider's web, each thread a different family pulling, tugging, testing the strands. And at the center, the Pope, caught between devotion and desire, between holy vows and the velvet trap of politics disguised as passion. You close your eyes, and the last thing you hear is the whisper of silk trailing across stone floors. When you open them again, you are in another chamber where the whispers shift in tone, not courtesans maneuvering, but rumors darker still, murmured about popes whose companions were not women at all. The air cools as you step deeper into the labyrinth, and the laughter of courtesans fades into hushed whispers of a different kind. These aren't the playful giggles of women in emerald silk, but the sharp, scandalous murmurs of clerics trading rumors too dangerous to write down. You hear the words slip through the air like smoke. Male lovers. The firm historical anchor is this. Medieval popes were often accused by rivals of sodomy, a charge that carried not only moral outrage but political weight. Whether true or fabricated, the accusation was common enough to become a weapon. Pope Julius III, in the mid-16th century, faced open scandal over his relationship with a young man nicknamed Innocenzo, a beggar boy he elevated to the rank of cardinal. Their closeness provoked gossip across Europe, and while Julius tried to downplay it, the whispers never died. You picture the scene vividly. A boy, plucked from the streets, suddenly clad in crimson robes, standing beside the Pope at banquets. His presence stirred envy, suspicion, and laughter. You hear the scrape of silver plates, the strained chuckles of cardinals pretending not to notice the favoritism. The tension in the room is palpable, like the taut string of a lute before it snaps. A quirky tidbit gives the story an almost surreal edge. Innocenzo was described as illiterate, barely able to sign his name, yet was granted one of the highest offices in the church. Critics called him the cardinal monkey, mocking his background while marveling at the power he wielded simply through affection. You imagine him lounging lazily in jeweled slippers, the symbol of scandal incarnate. But step back. Scholars are still divided on how to interpret such tales. Were these truly romantic liaisons, or merely deep patronage relationships exaggerated by enemies into sordid caricature? Historians still argue whether the word sodomy in accusations meant actual intimacy or was simply a political slur to undermine papal credibility. The truth remains slippery, flickering in shadows like torchlight across the walls. You let the sensory details wash over you. The faint musk of sweat clings to velvet chairs. The candle smoke curls into shapes that look like intertwined figures. The soft crack of a log in the hearth punctuates the silence after scandalous laughter. Every detail makes the room feel charged, not with prayer, but with tension. Touch the carved armrest of a papal throne. Its surface is smooth and cold, but beneath your palm you imagine the heat of a hand gripping it nervously while whispers swirled around the court. Smell the mix of expensive oils used to mask sweat. Hear the shuffling of feet as courtiers pretended not to see, and feel the weight of gazes darting across the room. You reflect on the irony. Vows of celibacy broken with women were scandalous enough, but accusations of male lovers struck even deeper. They undercut not just the sanctity of the office, but the very masculinity of papal authority, in a world obsessed with lineage and virility. And yet, even in scandal, the popes maintained power, their authority undimmed by rumors that might have destroyed lesser men. It leaves you wondering, was the strength of the papacy so great that it could weather any rumor, or did scandal itself become a kind of power, a demonstration that no amount of gossip could topple Rome? As the thought lingers, the whispers soften, fading into the hum of prayers rising outside. The candles burn lower, shadows lengthen, and you find yourself drawn onward into another chamber, where contradictions become even sharper, where relics of saints glowed on altars, while nightly indulgence unfolded in secret. The murmurs of scandal fade as you move forward, and soon you are surrounded by a different sound altogether, the chanting of monks rising and falling in long, hypnotic waves. The smell here is thick with frankincense, almost dizzying, as though the air itself has been drenched in prayer. You are in the Vatican's sanctum, staring at relics glittering beneath candlelight, bones in jeweled reliquaries, scraps of fabric said to belong to saints, chalices touched only by consecrated hands. And yet even here you sense the irony. The same pope who bowed to kiss these relics at dawn often slipped away to very different rituals at dusk. Here's the steady historical fact. Medieval popes sponsored relics, pilgrimages, and church building with enormous enthusiasm, often turning Rome into a carnival of sanctity. Pope Boniface VIII, for example, declared the first Jubilee in 1300, encouraging pilgrims from across Europe to flood into Rome to receive indulgences. The papacy, at least on paper, stood as the guardian of holiness, drawing the faithful like moths to a flame. But the quirky tidbit creeps in. Pope John XII, already infamous for his wild life, was accused by chroniclers of raising goblets to toast the pagan gods, even while hosting sacred ceremonies. The juxtaposition was so absurd that some scribes wrote as if they could hardly believe it themselves. A man consecrating relics by day and cavorting with lovers by night. Imagine the smell of incense still clinging to his robes as he slipped into chambers reeking of wine and musk. You press your fingers against the cold glass of a reliquary, tracing the outline of a jeweled cross. The glass fogs slightly with your breath, and for a fleeting moment, You imagine how surreal it must have been for visitors. The Pope as holy shepherd on the balcony, then the Pope as host of feasts whispered about with shame and delight. The scholarly debate lingers in the air. Were these accounts exaggerated to depict the papacy as hypocritical beyond redemption? Or do they reflect a reality where men could compartmentalize so perfectly, one role sacred, one profane? Historians continue to question whether John XII truly mixed paganism with papal duties, or if satirists and political enemies amplified his sins to undermine Rome's authority. Close your eyes, and the soundscape blends the solemn drone of monks chanting, the faint jingle of coins dropped by pilgrims, and underneath it, muffled laughter, and the splash of wine poured too quickly into chalices not meant for mass. The overlap makes you uneasy, like listening to two songs at once. The texture of this chamber tells its own story. You feel smooth marble polished by pilgrims' hands, and beneath your feet, rugs soft enough to hush footsteps as lovers passed quietly. You smell the burnt sweetness of incense mixed with rose water, a combination so thick it coats your tongue. The atmosphere hums with contradiction, holiness and desire locked in a dance, each pretending the other does not exist. And you reflect, perhaps this was the strangest magic of medieval Rome. It wasn't that popes sinned, every ruler sinned. It was that they sinned with one hand while raising the relic of a saint with the other, expecting the faithful to believe both could be true at once. As the monk's chant fades into the distance, you drift onward. The relics grow dim behind you, replaced by a different kind of glitter, the jeweled eyes of papal mistresses whose influence reached further than any relic ever could. Women whose whispers and embraces carried more weight than the votes of half the College of Cardinals. The jeweled reliquaries fade behind you, and the air grows warmer again, perfume replacing incense, laughter replacing chants. You find yourself in a room heavy with velvet drapes and tapestries that muffle every sound, as though secrecy itself has been stitched into the fabric. Here sit the papal mistresses, women whose presence was more dangerous than any army, for their influence seeped not only through bedchambers but through every corridor of power. The grounding historical fact lands like a steady drumbeat. Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, wasn't simply a man with mistresses. He was a man whose partners reshaped the politics of Italy. Venosa dei Catanei bore him children who became instruments of diplomacy, while another mistress, Julia Farnese, so captivated him that her own brother Alessandro rose swiftly through the ranks to become Pope Paul III. The sway of these women was undeniable, and their beauty translated directly into power. You glance at Julia's portrait in your imagination, golden hair tumbling, eyes half-shielded, as though guarding secrets too perilous to speak. She was nicknamed Julia la Bella, and her influence was such that whispers claimed she sat beside the Pope at audiences, openly acknowledged as his companion. Rome gossiped, laughed, and raged, yet nothing shook her grip on his heart or his court. The quirky tidbit flickers into the picture. Some Roman satirists scrawled mocking graffiti on the walls of the city, calling her the Pope's concubine. One crude sketch even depicted her leading the papal mule by its reins, a biting joke that the Holy Father himself was being led by a woman's hand. You can almost hear the snickers of apprentices daubing ink onto plaster, knowing the joke could cost them their lives if discovered. Yet, pause here. Scholars disagree over how much true political weight mistresses wielded. Were Julia and Venosa active architects of power, or were they merely symbols of papal weakness, their real influence exaggerated by enemies? Historians still puzzle over whether women like Julia maneuvered consciously or were swept along by currents larger than themselves. The question lingers, unresolved, like perfume after the woman has left the room. Close your eyes and feel the scene around you. Cushions sink under your weight, silk slides against your skin, goblets sweat with chilled wine. The atmosphere is intoxicating. Every sense-layered scent of amber oil, sound of hushed laughter, sight of jewels catching candlelight. You can almost touch the warm hand of a woman resting against yours, her fingers light but heavy with implication. And you realize the danger of these relationships was not just scandal, it was political volatility. A pope in love was a pope vulnerable, and ambitious families knew how to exploit that. Mistresses weren't merely companions, they were keys to bishoprics, gatekeepers to favours, and occasionally, puppeteers of Rome itself. You think about the irony. The Vatican thundered against Eve's temptation in sermons, while inside its own walls women whispered their way into the marrow of power. The story of papal mistresses wasn't just about sin, it was about the human heart, fragile even when clothed in the garments of absolute authority. As the laughter fades and the shadows lengthen, you feel the current tugging you onward, toward an even darker corridor, where favours themselves take on flesh, and where bishoprics are traded not for gold but for desire. You follow the trail of laughter into a corridor lined with portraits, stern faces of bishops and cardinals staring down as though daring you to guess how they earned their red hats. Their gazes follow you, heavy with unspoken stories, and soon you arrive at a chamber where whispers grow sharper, more transactional. Here, the air smells not of incense or perfume, but of ink, parchment, and wine. This is where the flesh itself was currency, where positions in the church were traded like favours at a gaming table. The grounding fact steadies you. Nepotism and simony, the sale of offices, were rampant in the medieval papacy, but what's often glossed over is how sexual favours became tangled in these exchanges. Records hint at bishoprics granted, abbeys secured, and cardinals' hats distributed in return for loyalties that began not at the altar but in the bedroom. Alexander VI again looms large, accused of elevating his own children and their spouses, but also of promoting those who curried favour through more intimate means. A quirky tidbit drifts through the smoky air. Pope Sixtus IV, the builder of the Sistine Chapel, was lampooned in Rome as the pope who made nephews, a sly joke hinting that many of his relatives promoted to power were actually illegitimate sons or favourites whose advancement was tied less to holiness than to whispered arrangements. The pun stuck, repeated in bawdy taverns until it became part of the city's living folklore. The atmosphere here is thick with duplicity. You hear the scratch of a quill signing a parchment grant, followed immediately by the soft click of a door closing, a silence that says the real bargain has just been sealed elsewhere. You smell candle wax mixing with the faint musk of sweat, a combination that makes every document feel less like Holy Writ and more like a contract of flesh. And yet, the scholarly debate continues. Were these tales of flesh for favours reliable truths, or were they the invention of critics determined to paint Rome as irredeemably corrupt? Some historians suggest the language of scandal often masked more mundane corruption, money changing hands rather than bodies. Others insist the personal correspondence and satirical verses of the time reveal something deeper, something flesh and blood beneath the parchment. The truth wavers, like shadows cast on frescoed ceilings. Run your hand along the carved table in the centre of the chamber. It is gouged with scratches from knives, stained with ink blotches, sticky with spilled wine. Imagine how many appointments were signed here, how many lives altered by a stroke of a quill, all while knowing the real bargaining took place behind heavy curtains in candlelit rooms. The soundscape builds, the murmur of voices negotiating, the faint laugh of someone who knows they've secured a prize, the scrape of a chair pulled back too quickly in triumph, and just beneath it, the sigh of someone whose dignity was spent in exchange for a title they could never otherwise have earned. You reflect on the irony. Sermons thundered against prostitution outside the Vatican's walls, yet inside, the very structure of the church was sometimes greased by it. Celibacy vows weren't just broken in secret, they were broken as a mechanism of political advancement. And so, you sit back, the hypocrisy pressing on you like the damp weight of velvet curtains. The portraits above still stare, their painted eyes cold, as if daring you to ask how they arrived in those gilded frames. You don't need to. The answer is written in the silence between candle flickers, in the soft echo of doors that close too quietly. And just as you breathe deeply of this paradox, you hear a different creak in the distance, the sound of convent gates opening, footsteps on stone, and the faint rustle of habits. The whispers shift again, moving from courtesans and nephews to women who wore veils of devotion yet found themselves at the center of papal desire. The sound of convent gates creaking open draws you onward. The air grows cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender soap and candle smoke that clings to habits freshly laundered. You find yourself stepping into cloisters where silence was meant to reign, stone arches casting long shadows, corridors echoing with the soft shuffle of sandaled feet. But tonight, the quiet is pierced by a different rhythm, the hushed rustle of fabric in the dark, footsteps that don't belong, doors closing with deliberate care. You realize you've entered the realm of forbidden nun affairs, the whispered stories of papal visits to cloisters meant to be untouchable. The grounding historical fact steadies the scene. In the Middle Ages, convents were not only religious houses but also political instruments, often filled with noblewomen whose families placed them there for reasons of status or economy. Popes and cardinals wielded enormous power over these institutions, and that imbalance left the door open sometimes literally for transgressions. Records exist of popes accused of affairs with nuns, though the details were often buried under layers of rumor and outrage. One infamous example flickers to life. Pope Pius II, while celebrated for his literary skill, wrote candidly in his early years about clerics who indulged in convent liaisons. His own youth was marked by tales of desire, and though later as Pope he thundered against immorality, the hypocrisy rang through every chapel. Convents, meant to be sanctuaries, became in the gossip of Rome places where the holy and the profane crossed paths under cover of night. A quirky tidbit peeks from the shadows. Some chronicles jested that popes kept keys to certain convents in Rome, jokingly called the Pope's Gardens. The nickname suggested not cloistered devotion, but cultivated pleasure, private spaces tended as carefully as orchards, though the fruit was human rather than divine. You can almost hear the laughter of satirists scribbling that metaphor in taverns, a joke sharp enough to sting yet believable enough to spread. You lean closer, letting the sensory details envelope you. Touch the cold stone of the cloister wall, its surface slick with evening damp. Hear the faint chanting from a distant chapel, an echo of vows kept by some, ignored by others. Smell the beeswax candles still burning, their sweetness mingling with the musky scent of sweat that betrays secrecy. In the corner, you imagine a door ajar, lamplight spilling onto the stones, the soft sound of whispered voices where no voices should be. The scholarly debate lingers here like incense that refuses to fade. Did these papal visits truly happen, or were they fabrications meant to scandalize? Some historians argue that enemies of Rome exaggerated isolated cases to paint the papacy as irredeemably corrupt. Others note that legal documents from the Inquisition occasionally reference accusations of convent liaisons, suggesting there was fire behind the smoke. The truth, like the echo of sandal steps in the cloister, is impossible to pin down. You reflect on the strangeness of it. Women who had vowed to Christ becoming pawns in papal desire. Cloisters turned into theatres of scandal. The irony is thick, almost suffocating the same voices that thundered about purity from pulpits indulged in places consecrated to that very virtue. The soundscape around you swells. The hoot of an owl outside the convent walls, the whisper of habits brushing together, the slam of a door closed too quickly. The tension hums in your ears, both sacred and profane, devotion and desire locked in uneasy embrace. As you move forward, the cloister gates close behind you, the whispers dissolving into silence. But ahead, a different noise rises, the raucous laughter of Rome's streets, the clamour of taverns and torchlit alleys. You smell smoke, sweat, and cheap wine. The papal chambers fade into the background, replaced now by something more brazen, the world of Rome's brothels, and the astonishing fact that even here, the papacy found ways to profit. The cloister gates close behind you, and the silence of nuns' whispers is replaced by the raw, bawdy roar of Rome at night. The streets teem with noise boots on cobblestones, drunken songs rising from taverns, and the high-pitched laughter of women leaning from shuttered windows. The air smells thick with smoke from torches, roasted chestnuts sold by hawkers, and the sour-sweet tang of cheap wine. You drift through alleys until you stumble into a quarter that reeks of humanity's oldest trade, the brothels, marked by lanterns swaying above their doors. Here comes your grounding fact. Medieval Rome was infamous for its brothels, and astonishingly, the papacy itself profited from them. In the 15th century, popes imposed taxes on prostitution, turning vice into revenue. Pope Sixtus IV, the same man who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, also sanctioned a special tax on Rome's brothels to fill Vatican coffers. That paradox lingers in the air like a bad joke. The patron of Michelangelo was also the patron of madams. You feel the pull of the streets, the hum of men bargaining not only for ale but for company. Coins clink, hands shake, curtains part briefly to reveal silhouettes behind flickering candlelight. The papacy, condemning lust from pulpits, quietly counted the coins gathered from it each night. A quirky tidbit makes the picture almost surreal. Rome's prostitutes were required to wear distinctive clothing, often yellow veils, to mark their trade. The money collected from taxing these women supposedly helped fund bridges and churches. Imagine stepping across the Ponte Sisto, built under Sixtus IV, knowing the silver that paid for its stones came in part from the earnings of Rome's red light district. You hear the slap of water against the bridge pylons, mingling with the memory of laughter echoing from the streets. And yet, pause here. Historians disagree on how cynical this system truly was. Some argue the taxes were simply pragmatic, a way to regulate what could never be eradicated. Others suggest they reveal deep hypocrisy, that the papacy not only tolerated vice, but actively depended on it. The debate hangs unresolved, like a lantern swaying in the night breeze, shedding just enough light to unsettle you. The sensory details close in. The texture of the cobblestones is rough beneath your feet, damp from spilled ale. The air feels sticky, humid with sweat, perfume and smoke. The voices blur together, a constant hum of bargaining, teasing, and singing. You reach out to brush a wall plastered with graffiti mocking sketches of cardinals, obscene verses that city guards pretend not to notice. And as you listen, you realize the deeper paradox. These women were both condemned and essential. Their labor was exploited twice, once in the brothel itself, and again when their wages were siphoned into papal coffers. The Vatican condemned lust as mortal sin, even as it quietly used the earnings to pave Rome's streets. You pause at a brothel doorway, peering inside. Cushions scattered, curtains heavy with dust, the smell of unwashed bodies masked by cheap oils. The room vibrates with laughter, but also with resignation, lives folded into transactions. And behind it all, you can almost see a clerk in the Vatican tallying up the taxes at dawn, quill scratching across parchment as if it were just another tithe. The street noise fades as you move away, but the memory lingers, the hypocrisy etched into every stone bridge and chapel funded by the wages of sin. And up ahead, the clamour softens into something stranger. Not the marketplace or the brothel, but the disguised footsteps of popes themselves, slipping out into these same streets under false names, wrapped in cloaks to hide what crowns could not. The rowdy laughter of Rome's brothel quarter fades behind you, replaced by the softer, almost conspiratorial hush of footsteps on cobblestone. The torches here burn lower, the streets narrower, and every shadow feels alive. You follow the sound of boots scuffing quickly, almost furtively, and you realize what you're hearing: popes themselves, slipping into the night in disguise. The grounding fact steadies you. Several medieval and Renaissance popes were rumored to sneak out of their palaces dressed as common men, shedding the trappings of holiness to explore the city incognito. Pope John XXIII, before he was deposed at the Council of Constance in the early 15th century, was accused of wandering taverns in disguise, indulging in pleasures forbidden to his office. Even Pope Alexander VI, with all his wealth and power, was said to enjoy slipping into the city at night, cloaked and hooded, seeking entertainment without the scrutiny of cardinals. You picture it vividly. A man who spent the day seated on the papal throne now pulling a hood low over his forehead, slipping out a side gate with only a guard or two, the iron latch closing softly behind him. The streets smell of roasting meat, stale ale, and wet stone, a stark contrast to the perfumes and incense of the Vatican. He pushes open the door of a tavern and is greeted not with bows but with laughter, a hand clapping him on the back as though he were just another customer. A quirky tidbit adds flavour to the picture. Chroniclers tell of Pope Paul II, in the 15th century, who was obsessed with dressing extravagantly silks, jewels, fine hats. Satirists joked that when he disguised himself to walk the streets, his vanity betrayed him. Even hidden in plain wool, his fingers glittered with rings, and the townsfolk whispered, "Only a man of the Vatican would flash like that." You can almost see him lifting a mug to his lips while trying and failing to look ordinary. But of course, the truth is contested. Some scholars argue these tales of disguise are little more than gossip spread by enemies eager to show the papacy as corrupt, sneaking among taverns like rogues. Others suggest that at least some stories ring true, because rulers throughout history, from caliphs to kings, often disguised themselves to watch their people or taste forbidden freedoms. Historians still wonder whether the popes did the same out of lust, curiosity, or sheer boredom. The sensory details sharpen. You hear the laughter of dice games clattering across wooden tables, the creak of a tavern bench under heavy bodies, the squeak of a barmaid's shoes on wet straw scattered across the floor. You smell sour beer, smoke curling from clay pipes, and the musk of bodies pressed too close together in dim light. Touch the rough grain of the table, sticky with spilled drink, and imagine the Pope's hand there, disguised under a simple glove, though the weight of his ring betrays him. You reflect on the strange courage or foolishness of such ventures. To be the most powerful man in Christendom, and still crave the thrill of slipping unseen through alleys, speaks to the contradictions at the heart of the papacy. By day, holiness incarnate. By night, a man who wanted anonymity or perhaps just adventure. The hooded figure passes by you now, cloak brushing against your arm, and you hear his low chuckle as he disappears into the tavern's glow. For a moment you catch the glint of his eyes, and you know this is no ordinary wanderer. And then, as quickly as he came, the disguise is gone. You're pulled onward into the papal chambers again, where the masks were not worn on the streets but within the palace itself, where jokes so crude they could never be preached were scrawled in margins and murmured among cardinals. The tavern's laughter fades, and now you find yourself in a chamber quieter, but somehow more dangerous. Candles sputter in iron sconces, casting shadows that twist like mocking faces along the frescoed walls. Here, there is no music, no feasting, just the scratch of quills in margins, the sly curve of lips when a joke is whispered too low for official ears. You've wandered into the world of papal humour, bawdy and sharp, jokes that could never be preached from a pulpit yet flourished in the corners of the Vatican. The historical anchor grounds you. Satire about popes circulated widely in medieval Rome. Chronicles, poems, and even graffiti mocked papal morals, often lacing humour with accusations of lust. Sometimes the popes themselves joined in, indulging in coarse jests at banquets or in private gatherings. Pope Leo X, in the early 16th century, was notorious for his hearty appetite for entertainment music, plays, and yes, jokes that blurred the line between holy and scandalous. And here comes the quirky tidbit. One tale describes Pope Paul II being mocked not only for his excesses but for his supposed obsession with melons. Satirists joked about his fruitful passions, a sly innuendo scribbled in pamphlets circulated by enemies. Imagine cardinals passing around scraps of parchment with crude sketches, laughing behind their hands while incense still smouldered on the altar. You can almost hear the snort of suppressed laughter, the scrape of quills, etching something too scandalous to read aloud. Yet, the scholars remain divided. Did popes themselves encourage bawdy humour, or was this all the work of enemies? Some historians argue that the circulation of obscene verse was mostly anti-papal propaganda meant to scandalize the faithful. Others suggest the papal courts, like all royal courts, thrived on ribald wit as part of their culture. The truth, as always, is murky, flickering like shadows on the wall. You let the sensory details sink in. The air smells of wax and old parchment, the tang of ink sharp in your nostrils. The texture of the manuscripts is rough under your fingertips, vellum scarred by jokes never meant for mass. You hear the low chuckle of cardinals, their voices hushed but edged with mischief. One voice imitates a rival's sermon in falsetto, another recites a mock prayer ending in obscenity. Touch the margin of a page, and you find doodles a donkey in papal tiara, a bishop drawn with exaggerated features. These aren't holy texts anymore. They're playgrounds of irreverence. Even the holiest men needed release, and humor became its own form of indulgence. You reflect on the irony. In a church that condemned obscenity, bawdy humor was alive and well, seeping even into sacred spaces. Perhaps the jokes weren't just entertainment, they were pressure valves, tiny rebellions in a system too heavy with rules. The laughter grows louder, echoing strangely through the chamber, until you realize it isn't laughter at all, it's something harsher. The crack of a whip, the thud of flesh against stone. You've crossed a threshold again, and now the humor is gone, replaced by the sound of flagellation, of pain and desire, twisted together in a chamber where devotion and punishment blur. The laughter dies abruptly, and what replaces it makes your skin prickle. The air grows colder, heavy with the iron scent of blood mixed faintly with incense. You hear it clearly now, the sharp crack of leather against flesh, followed by a muffled gasp. You've entered a chamber where piety and desire have become inseparable, where flagellation is not only penance but something darker, stranger, and more intimate. Here's the historical anchor. Self-flagellation was a recognized practice in medieval Christianity, meant as penance for sin. Confraternities of flagellants marched through towns, whipping their own backs in public to demonstrate devotion. Some popes encouraged these practices as reminders of Christ's suffering. Yet, behind closed doors, flagellation blurred into something else. Whispers suggested certain pontiffs and their companions turned acts of penance into moments of strange delight, where pain mingled with pleasure. A quirky tidbit emerges from chronicles of Pope Clement VI in the 14th century. He reportedly scoffed at the extreme flagellant movements that swept Europe, calling them dangerous and fanatical. Yet satirists later twisted the story, suggesting that Clement indulged in private scourging rituals of his own, though in far less holy contexts. The image of the Pope, clad in silk, submitting to lashes in candlelit chambers, became fodder for rumor, regardless of whether it was truth or exaggeration. The sensory details are impossible to ignore. You feel the chill of stone beneath your feet, smell the wax of candles mixed with sweat, hear the steady rhythm of lashes followed by quiet, almost reverent sighs. The texture of leather, slick with oil, stings your imagination. Each sound echoes longer than it should, filling the chamber until it feels like you're trapped inside the heartbeat of the ritual itself. But pause, the scholars disagree, as they always do. Were these stories about papal flagellation as erotic ritual genuine, or the inventions of enemies eager to depict popes as depraved? Some historians argue that conflating penance with pleasure was a literary trope used to mock the Church. Others admit that the blurred lines between ascetic practices and bodily sensation could easily have bred situations ripe for scandal. The debate lingers like smoke, never fully clearing. You lean closer and notice the marks left behind. On the stone wall, faint stains darkened into permanence. On the wooden bench, grooves from nails gripping too tightly. On the air itself, a tension that makes every breath feel heavy. The chamber hums with contradiction. Was this punishment, or indulgence masquerading as piety? You reflect on the paradox. Perhaps what began as devotion easily tipped into desire. Pain sharpened awareness, heightened the senses, made the flesh feel more alive than any hymn. And for a pope used to indulgence in every other form, why wouldn't flagellation itself be twisted into another theatre of excess? The echoes grow fainter now, the whip falling silent, the sighs fading into the thick stillness of candle smoke. You turn, and in the dim light you notice another door, this one carved with family crests, its frame heavy with silence. On the other side, darker rumors wait, whispered accusations of relationships even more forbidden. stories of papal entanglements within their own bloodlines. The heavy door creaks open, and the silence that follows feels heavier than any whip crack. The air here is stifling, as though weighed down by the burden of whispers too dangerous to speak aloud. You step into a chamber adorned with family crests, lions, lilies, eagles painted proudly on the walls, though their very presence makes the atmosphere uneasy. This is where the rumors of incest in papal palaces take shape, half-truths tangled with scandal, whispered not only to shock, but to destroy reputations. The historical fact that anchors you, during the so-called Pornocracy of the 10th century, the papacy was dominated by the Theophylact family of Rome. Marozia, a noblewoman of extraordinary influence, was said to be the mistress of Pope Sergius III and the mother of a future pope, John XI. Chroniclers hostile to her claimed she also maintained liaisons with other family members, casting the entire papal household as a den of incest and corruption. While the evidence is murky, the accusations became legend, painting a picture of a papacy trapped in family webs of lust and ambition. The quirky tidbit comes in the form of satire. Later, chroniclers mocked the period as a rule of harlots, suggesting Rome was governed not by saints but by scandalous women weaving intrigues in bedrooms. One writer even joked that the papal throne was less a seat of holiness and more a family armchair, passed from lover to son with shocking casualness. The image is grotesque and comic all at once, like watching history turned into farce. But the debate persists. Were Marozia and her kin truly guilty of incest? Or was the charge simply the sharpest weapon their enemies could hurl? Historians remain divided, noting that medieval chroniclers often used accusations of sexual depravity to delegitimize political foes. Perhaps Marozia was powerful, perhaps ruthless, but whether she was guilty of what was claimed remains unresolved, hanging in the air like a shadow that refuses to leave. The sensory details in this chamber are unsettling. You feel the cold smoothness of marble tiles, yet beneath it a stickiness as though secrets themselves had seeped into the floor. The air smells stale, musty, carrying a faint odor of wax melted too many times. The walls seem to close in, heavy with painted coats of arms, as if reminding you that this was a family affair in every sense. Listen carefully. You hear the faint rustle of silk gowns, the creak of a bed hidden behind drapes, and outside the door, the low voices of gossips whispering accusations into parchment. Every sound feels intrusive, as though you shouldn't be listening at all. You pause to reflect. Incest, whether real or imagined, served as the ultimate scandal, the one sin that could strip away every shred of papal sanctity. Whether or not it happened, the mere rumor was enough to stain centuries. And perhaps that was the point. In a world where power was fragile, nothing undermined authority faster than whispers that blurred family and desire. As you step away, the crests on the wall seem to watch you, their painted lions baring teeth in silent warning. You push open another door, and this time the smell that greets you is not musty but sharp spices, herbs, strange concoctions simmering in brass cauldrons. You have left behind the shadows of incest to enter another realm entirely, where papal desire met alchemy and the pursuit of unnatural strength. The musty air of family scandals fades, replaced by a sharper scent spices, crushed herbs, and something metallic, like copper simmering too long. You've wandered into a chamber that feels more like an apothecary than a palace. Shelves sag under the weight of jars filled with strange powders, dried roots, and liquids glowing faintly in the candlelight. Mortars and pestles lie scattered, and brass cauldrons bubble with concoctions that hiss and spit. This is where alchemy met appetite, where popes and their companions sought to bend nature itself in service of desire. The grounding fact here: medieval and Renaissance elites often turned to alchemists and physicians for aphrodisiacs. The papal court was no exception. Contemporary records describe physicians in Rome preparing tonics to restore vigor for aging churchmen. Pope Innocent VIII, for instance, was rumored to consume strange remedies in hopes of prolonging his failing vitality. Though most accounts focus on his health, later whispers suggested these tonics were not only about survival, but about sustaining desires well into impossible ages. A quirky tidbit drifts up from chronicles that sound half like rumor, half like parody. Pope Leo X, lover of excess in all things, was said to experiment with hippocras, a spiced wine infused with exotic herbs, believed to stir passion as well as pleasure. Some pamphlets mocked him, claiming he treated such potions as casually as others drank table wine, a pope sipping aphrodisiacs between banquets. Whether true or slander, the image is unforgettable. A man in papal white raising a jeweled goblet, the liquid inside glowing with cinnamon and crushed pepper. But again, the scholars disagree. Did popes truly consume such potions? Or were the stories simply slurs designed to paint them as decadent alchemists dabbling in forbidden arts? Historians still puzzle over references to restorative draughts in papal records. Were these medicines, or euphemisms for something stranger? The uncertainty lingers, like steam curling from a cauldron, refusing to dissipate. The sensory details are overwhelming. You smell cloves, nutmeg, saffron, rare spices imported at enormous cost mixed with bitter roots that sting your nose. You feel the sticky residue of syrup clinging to your fingers as you touch a vial, the glass warm from being near the fire. You hear the bubbling of liquid, the hiss as steam escapes, the sharp crackle of logs feeding the flames beneath the cauldron. The chamber feels alive, as though the very air were laced with potion. Touch the shelves, and you find them gritty, coated with spilled powders. Taste the air, metallic and sweet at once. And you can imagine how easily a desperate old man might believe that just one more draught could restore youth. The atmosphere is intoxicating in its own way, half science, half sorcery, all shrouded in secrecy. You reflect on the irony. A church that condemned magic found its leaders dabbling in something perilously close to it, blurring medicine with alchemy, science with superstition. Perhaps the pursuit of virility was simply another form of power, one more tool to sustain an image of vitality, even as age crept in. As the bubbling quiets, you notice the cauldron's steam rising into the shape of strange figures, almost like bodies entwined in the candlelight haze. The vision fades quickly, leaving you unsettled. You turn, and beyond the alchemy chamber lies another space, alive with echoes, not whispers now, but shouts and laughter, the pounding rhythm of drums. Ahead lies something wilder, more chaotic, the midnight orgies whispered of in every corner of Europe, where the line between feast and frenzy vanished altogether. The acrid steam of alchemy fades, and now the night itself seems to vibrate beneath your feet. You follow the sound drums pounding low, voices raised not in prayer but in raucous cries, the sharp crack of laughter cutting through thick air. As you push open the next heavy door, the smell engulfs you. Sweat, spiced wine, smoke, and perfume all woven into one dizzying cloud. You've stumbled into the whispered world of the midnight orgies, those infamous gatherings where the papacy's contradictions reached their wildest form. The grounding historical fact comes into view. Rome in the 15th and 16th centuries was rife with tales of papal feasts that dissolved into unrestrained revelry. Alexander VI, again, is remembered as presiding over the Banquet of Chestnuts, a night where courtesans allegedly crawled naked across the floor gathering chestnuts while cardinals watched. Whether exaggerated or not, the story became shorthand across Europe for papal debauchery. The papal court, it was said, had blurred the boundary between a council hall and a brothel. A quirky tidbit makes the scene even stranger. Some accounts claim Alexander VI awarded prizes to those men who could couple the greatest number of times during the night's revels. Chroniclers say the prizes were cloaks of silk and pairs of finely bred horses, as though lust itself were a tournament sport. You can almost hear the drunken applause, the cheering voices egging on a grotesque contest staged in chambers that by day hosted prayers. But as always, the historians pull you back. Was the Banquet of Chestnuts real, or propaganda created by enemies of the Borgia family? Scholars still divide, some dismissing the tale as impossible slander, others insisting that the sheer detail preserved in multiple accounts suggests a kernel of truth. The uncertainty feels like the very air of the room, thick, unstable, never letting you breathe fully. You let the atmosphere wash over you. The candles drip wax in thick streams, smoke curling into the shape of twisting bodies. You hear the pounding of drums mixing with the thud of feet on marble, the clatter of goblets tossed carelessly aside, the high-pitched laughter of women drunk on both wine and spectacle. Touch the polished table, it's sticky, with spilled honey, rough with crumbs of bread, damp with wine soaking into the grain. The sensation is overwhelming. The air clings to your skin, humid with body heat, every breath carrying the scent of musk and cinnamon. You hear the low murmur of private bargains made in corners, the slap of flesh against velvet cushions, the squeak of shoes stepping on chestnuts crushed into the floor. And yet you reflect, perhaps the truth is not whether these orgies happened exactly as described, but that they were believable. The papacy had so thoroughly entwined itself with excess that Europe could imagine its highest priest hosting contests of lust and laugh without hesitation. The night in this chamber never seems to end. Time dissolves, hours blurred into one endless frenzy. And when the music finally fades, when the torches burn low, the silence that follows is not peace but exhaustion. The Vatican wakes the next day as if nothing happened, sermons delivered as though the night before had been only a dream. You turn, the heat clinging to you, and step into a quieter passage where the smell of smoke gives way to something colder. Ahead, you glimpse a desk, littered with parchment and star charts, and you realize the popes did not only indulge in bodies, they also looked to the heavens themselves, reading fates in stars to guide their most secret affairs. The echoes of drums and laughter fade, replaced by a gentler hum, the scratch of quills on parchment, the faint clatter of astrolabes turning in careful hands. The chamber you step into feels cooler, calmer, but no less strange. Its walls are lined with shelves of manuscripts, star charts pinned to wooden panels, and globes half lit by candlelight. This is not a place of revelry, but of calculation. Here, the popes, those who preached divine providence, turned to astrology, seeking in the stars guidance not only for war or governance, but for their own tangled webs of desire. The grounding fact is clear enough. Astrology was widely practiced in medieval and Renaissance courts. Even the Vatican, despite condemning superstition, employed astrologers. Pope Sixtus IV consulted star charts for important decisions, and Julius II is believed to have relied on astrologers to pick auspicious dates. Though official doctrine frowned on divination, in practice it was woven into papal life, hidden behind scholarly language. A quirky tidbit flickers like starlight. Some chronicles claim Pope Alexander VI consulted astrologers not only for statecraft, but for his romantic pursuits. Rumors suggested he chose the timing of liaisons based on planetary alignments, believing certain nights heightened fertility or passion. Imagine him leaning over a parchment chart, nodding gravely as a court astrologer pointed to Venus rising, while outside his mistress waited in candlelit chambers. The image is half comic, half unsettling, a pope treating desire as though it were a liturgical calendar. But again, the scholars argue, did the popes truly weave astrology into their romantic decisions? Or were such stories embroidered by enemies eager to paint them as hypocrites dabbling in forbidden arts? Historians still dispute whether these tales reflect genuine practice or slander amplified by satire. The truth glimmers like a distant star, visible yet unreachable. The sensory details draw you in. You touch the parchment of a star chart, the ink still faintly raised against your fingertips, rough and dry. You smell the mingled scents of beeswax candles and parchment dust. You hear the faint metallic click of an armillary sphere turning, its rings clattering like distant bells. The room is heavy with the silence of study, but beneath it hums the knowledge that these calculations served not only politics but passion. You reflect on the irony. A church that claimed the heavens belonged to God still allowed its leaders to search those same heavens for the timing of private indulgence. Astrology here was not rebellion but convenience, a way to dress desire in the language of fate. Imagine a pope walking from this chamber into another, one moment nodding solemnly at Jupiter's position, the next slipping through curtains into a bedchamber warmed by firelight. The stars, in their vast distance, became part of the choreography of sin. The charts flutter in the draught as you step away, the candles sputtering, and beyond the door lies a darker chamber still, where the overlap between spiritual authority and flesh is even more direct. Ahead waits the confessional, where whispered sins and whispered seductions sometimes became one and the same. The star charts fade behind you, their inked constellations trembling in the draught as the door shuts. Now you walk into a chamber that feels narrower, closer, heavy with the muffled weight of secrets. A wooden lattice divides the space, its grain worn smooth by countless fingertips, and on the other side you hear a whisper, low, urgent, trembling. You realize you are standing in a confessional, a place meant for absolution. But here, absolution is only half the story. The grounding historical fact: confession became formalized in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, when annual confession was required for every Christian. This gave priests and popes as the highest of them immense power, for they held the keys not only to forgiveness but to people's deepest vulnerabilities. In the papal court, that authority magnified. The pope was both ruler and confessor, spiritual father and political master. But rumors turned even this sacred act into scandal. A quirky tidbit arises from Roman satire. Enemies accused certain popes of using confession as a screen for seduction, whispering forgiveness with one breath while coaxing intimacy with the next. The confessional, shrouded in secrecy, became the perfect stage for blurred boundaries. Imagine a pope leaning close to hear sins of passion and responding not with penance but with a hand brushing against the wooden screen. It sounds theatrical, and perhaps it was, but the whispers stuck. Scholars, as always, remain divided. Some argue that tales of seduction in confession were political fabrications, slander invented by Protestant reformers eager to depict the papacy as predatory. Others suggest that in a world where spiritual and bodily intimacy often overlapped, some truth may lie beneath the satire. Historians still puzzle over the line between myth and misconduct, the truth hidden as tightly as the face behind the lattice. You let the sensory world wash over you. The wood of the confessional feels rough beneath your hand, scarred by scratches of restless fingers. The air smells of candle smoke and faint rose oil, the same oils often dabbed on the wrists of courtiers. You hear the catch of a breath on the other side, the whispered, "Forgive me, Father," followed by silence too long to be holy. The atmosphere is suffocating, heavy with intimacy, masquerading as sacrament. You imagine the touch of a hand through the screen, the warmth of breath so close it blurs the boundary between prayer and temptation. The silence itself becomes charged, as if every heartbeat were a choice between devotion and desire. And you reflect, perhaps it wasn't always about seduction, perhaps it was about control. The confessional gave popes and priests alike a power unmatched, the knowledge of sin that could shape loyalties, bend wills, or kindle shame deep enough to bind a soul forever. Desire may have played a role, but so did politics, and the confessional became a throne hidden within wood and shadow. As the whisper fades, you step away, leaving the wooden lattice behind. The chamber dissolves into silence, but only for a moment. Ahead, the echo of children's laughter drifts faintly strange, unsettling, in a place so fraught with vows of celibacy. You realize you are about to enter the realm of fertility, not as metaphor but as fact, where papal illegitimate children became bargaining chips on Europe's stage. The confessional's whispers fade, and now you hear a different sound, altogether lighter, brighter, though no less unsettling. Children's laughter, echoing down stone corridors, the patter of small feet on marble floors, voices shrill and joyous in a place where no such voices should exist. You step into a chamber that looks half like a nursery, half like a council hall. Cradles stand alongside gilded chairs, and toys lie scattered on carpets embroidered with papal crests. You've entered the strange theatre of fertility, where popes' illegitimate children became as central to diplomacy as relics or armies. The grounding historical fact steadies you. Pope Alexander VI fathered several children with Vanozza dei Catanei, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, who became pivotal figures in Italian politics. These weren't hidden offspring. They were openly acknowledged and used as tools for alliances. Cesare was appointed a cardinal at 18 before shedding the cassock to become a feared military leader. Lucrezia was married 3 times, each union designed to secure papal influence across powerful families. The Vatican nursery, it turned out, was an extension of the papal council chamber. The quirky tidbit flickers like candlelight. Cesare Borgia, while still technically a cardinal, was rumoured to parade through Rome in silken robes, flanked by lovers, sword at his side. Chroniclers described him as both cleric and soldier, saint and sinner, embodying the contradictions of his father's papacy. Imagine the irony, a supposed man of God strutting like a prince, his very existence proof of vows broken before he could even walk. Yet the scholars remain divided. Were these children truly symbols of papal scandal, or were they simply evidence that popes lived like other monarchs, dynasties hidden behind holy titles? Historians still puzzle over whether Alexander VI's family was uniquely scandalous or simply more visible, his enemies ensuring their every misstep was preserved in lurid detail. The sensory world wraps around you. You hear the squeak of wooden toys dragged across marble, the laughter of a child muffled by heavy curtains, the soft lull of a nurse singing a hymn reworked as a cradle song. You smell warm milk mixed with rosewater, the domestic scents strangely jarring against gilded walls. Touch the smooth wood of a cradle, polished to gleam like a reliquary, and realize that this furniture, too, was an instrument of power. The irony sinks in. The Vatican thundered against marriage for priests, demanded celibacy, and condemned lust. Yet its highest leader built dynasties from broken vows. Children became pawns, their marriages traded like gold, their lives plotted as carefully as military campaigns. The nursery was not a scandal to be hidden, it was a tool to be displayed when convenient. You pause, looking around the chamber, and for a moment you see it all clearly. The papacy as monarchy, the Pope as king, his children as courtiers shaping history. The laughter fades, the toys lie still, but the legacy remains, echoing in politics and wars long after the children themselves were gone. And as you step away, the sound of laughter is replaced by another shimmer, the rustle of silk and jewels, the glitter of clothing draped not just for fashion but for seduction. Ahead, the papal court becomes a stage where garments and gems themselves turned into instruments of desire. The echoes of children's laughter dissolve, and now you step into a hall bathed in golden light. Everywhere you look, silk shimmers, jewels sparkle, and the air hums with perfume so thick it clings to your skin. Here, flesh itself is dressed as theatre, and the boundaries between sacred vestments and seductive finery blur. You've entered the world where clothes, jewels, and flesh became tools of papal desire. The grounding historical fact steadies you. Renaissance popes, especially Alexander VI and Leo X, adored lavish displays of wealth. Their courts overflowed with silks from the East, velvets dyed in rare hues, and gems imported from across the Mediterranean. Clothing was not just ornament, it was politics. Mistresses and companions were arrayed in fabrics, so costly they rivaled the vestments worn during Mass. In papal Rome, the sparkle of jewels often carried as much weight as a papal bull. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Julia Farnese, mistress of Alexander VI, was so celebrated for her beauty that artists allegedly painted her features onto holy images of the Virgin Mary. Imagine it, devotees kneeling before a fresco, whispering prayers to the Virgin, while recognizing the unmistakable likeness of the Pope's beloved. The blending of sacred and sensual was both outrageous and absurd, like a private joke played on the faithful in broad daylight. The scholarly debate still smoulders. Did popes deliberately flaunt their companions in jewels to project power, or did satirists exaggerate their extravagance into scandalous caricature? Some historians argue that paintings of Julia were genuine devotional commissions, while others suggest her likeness was gossip, amplified until it became legend. The truth shimmers like the gems themselves, dazzling but impossible to hold. The sensory details here are overwhelming. You brush your hand across velvet draped over a couch, the fabric cool and heavy, almost liquid in its softness. You smell the sweet tang of amber oil and crushed rose petals rubbed into hair. You hear the faint jingle of pearls sewn into hems, the clatter of jeweled rings against goblets. Everywhere, the air vibrates with color emerald, ruby, sapphire, each stone a statement, each garment a declaration. You reflect on the irony. Sermons warned against vanity, against worldly display, yet within the Vatican, beauty was weaponized. Clothes and jewels transformed companions into symbols of divine-like radiance, their bodies elevated not by holiness, but by the shimmer of gold thread. Flesh, wrapped in splendor, became as sacred and as scandalous as relics on the altar. Imagine the scene: a papal mistress stepping into a chamber, silk whispering against the floor, jewels glittering in candlelight. Cardinals glance, pretend to look away, yet every eye is drawn to her. The weight of her gown is political, each gem a silent promise of favor. Even her laughter sounds richer, echoing off marble walls in a way that reminds you, this isn't merely desire, it's spectacle. And so you leave the chamber dazzled, your vision still swimming with flashes of gold and crimson. But as you move forward, the shimmer fades, replaced by a colder atmosphere, tinged with fear. The next room smells of smoke and herbs, whispers of curses and spells. Here, you find yourself among shadows where papal desire collided with darker suspicions, rumors of witchcraft, enchantments, and women accused of binding the Pope's heart with magic. The glow of jewels fades behind you, replaced by a darker scent, burnt herbs, bitter smoke, something sharp that stings the nose. The chamber you enter feels colder, lit not by gold but by the flicker of low torches casting restless shadows across stone walls. At the center, a table is cluttered with bowls of ash, bundles of dried plants, and wax figures pierced with pins. You've stepped into the shadow of witchcraft, where papal desire collided with fears of enchantment. The grounding historical fact is this: accusations of witchcraft surged in late medieval Europe, fueled by church courts and the publication of grim treatises like the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487. Even within the Vatican, women who grew too powerful or too beloved of a pope could be smeared as witches. The suggestion was clear: if a woman captivated the Holy Father beyond reason, it must have been sorcery. A quirky tidbit rises from the smoke. Julia Farnese, Julia the Beautiful, mistress of Alexander VI, was whispered about in exactly this way. Her rivals claimed she bewitched the Pope, that no ordinary woman could command such devotion. Some said she carried amulets under her gowns, charms to bind his desire. Of course, no evidence existed, but the rumor was delicious enough to survive. Retold in taverns where drinkers mocked that Rome was ruled not by the keys of St. Peter but by the spells of a courtesan. Scholars debate this uneasily. Were accusations of witchcraft simply misogyny, a convenient way to discredit women who wielded influence? Or did belief in enchantments genuinely shape papal behavior, making even the most powerful men fearful of invisible bonds? Historians still argue whether these whispers reflected real anxieties or were weapons wielded in Rome's endless wars of scandal. The sensory world here is intense. You smell sage and myrrh smouldering in brass dishes, mingling with the acrid tang of tallow. You hear the crackle of herbs burning, the occasional pop of resin sparking in the fire. Reach out and you feel the waxy surface of a small figurine, its chest gouged with a pin. The shadows twitch across the walls, making you think of faces hidden just out of sight. You reflect on the strangeness of it. For a church that thundered against magic, the fear of enchantment gave it constant power. By suggesting mistresses bound popes with spells, critics explained away desire while making the papacy look weak, ruled by women's unseen hands. Whether true or not, the very idea was enough to stain reputations forever. Imagine the Pope himself pacing at night, clutching a crucifix, half convinced that the warmth in his chest was not love but sorcery. Or imagine rivals whispering that Rome's greatest throne was nothing but a puppet seat, strings pulled by a witch behind velvet curtains. The torches sputter lower now, smoke curling into shapes that almost resemble faces. The air grows quieter, softer. You step past the table of herbs and charms, and ahead you glimpse parchment scattered across the floor, not spells this time, but poetry. The voices waiting in the next chamber are not those of witches, but of courtesans who turned their passions into verses that scandalized all of Rome. The scent of scorched herbs drifts away as you enter a chamber that feels altogether lighter, though no less subversive. Here, candlelight flickers not over wax dolls or bundles of sage, but across parchment scattered across the floor. You bend down and pick one up. The ink is fresh, the handwriting elegant, and the words are unmistakably verses of love. But these aren't hymns or prayers. They are poems written by women who moved within papal circles. Courtesans whose beauty was already notorious, now sharpened into scandal by their wit. The grounding historical fact is steady. Renaissance Rome celebrated poetry almost as much as politics. Courts were filled with humanist scholars, artists, and writers. Mistresses of powerful men, including the Pope himself, sometimes left behind verses that survive in archives, weaving their names into the cultural life of the city. While the Vatican thundered against vanity, its companions often shaped the very art and language of the age. One quirky tidbit shines in the candlelight. Julia Farnese, Alexander VI's celebrated mistress, was immortalized in verse, not only by others but rumored to have composed lines of her own. Satirists took advantage of this, penning bawdy counterpoems that twisted her image into something outrageous. The notion of a papal mistress exchanging verses her words whispered across salons made Rome chuckle and seethe in equal measure. Imagine noblemen reading stanzas that half praised, half mocked the woman who shared the Pope's bed. The lines themselves became part of her legend, mingling beauty with scandal. Yet, the scholars divide again. Did women like Julia truly write, or were poems attributed to them by rivals and lovers alike? Some historians suggest courtesans had the education and freedom to compose. Others argue the verses were satire, male-authored attacks disguised as women's voices. Historians still puzzle, the truth lost in the playful ink of competing hands. The sensory world is vivid here. You touch the parchment, it feels rough, fibrous, faintly warm from the flame nearby. The ink smudges slightly under your finger, leaving a dark stain that smells of iron and wine. You hear soft laughter as verses are recited in the corner, punctuated by applause and the sharp intake of breath when a particularly scandalous line lands. The air smells not of incense but of beeswax and ink, a mix that feels worldly, intellectual, slightly dangerous. Picture the scene: a gathering in a candlelit salon, courtesans reclining on cushions, cardinals pretending not to blush as poetry drips with double meanings. Every line carries risk, every rhyme another layer of seduction. For these women, poetry was both shield and sword, a way to claim voice in a world that reduced them to bodies. You reflect on the paradox. The Vatican condemned sensual art, yet allowed a culture where its mistresses became muses, shaping poetry that outlasted the sermons of the age. Perhaps the most shocking thing is not that these women were loved, but that they wrote, and in writing they scandalized Rome more deeply than kisses ever could. The chamber grows quieter as the readings end, the parchment fluttering to the floor like fallen petals. But ahead, you hear a different clamor. Not laughter, not applause, but the murmur of factions and the slam of doors. You realize you are stepping into a new chamber where rival popes, rival courts, and rival beds collided during times of schism, lust entwined with politics in the ugliest of ways. The laughter of salons fades, replaced by the low rumble of argument. Doors slam, voices rise, and the air feels charged with division. You've entered a hall where two papal thrones face each other across the chamber, each draped in crimson, each claiming legitimacy. The Great Schism of the 14th and 15th centuries wasn't only a war of theology or politics, it was also a struggle where rival popes wielded not just swords of doctrine, but the whispers of bedrooms. The grounding historical fact steadies you. From 1378 to 1417, the papacy was split between Rome and Avignon, with rival pontiffs claiming the throne. These competing courts weren't just centers of faith, they became hubs of power, patronage, and scandal. Each pope sought to discredit the other, and accusations of sexual corruption became weapons of propaganda. Rome accused Avignon of debauchery. Avignon accused Rome of lust dressed in velvet. A quirky tidbit emerges from the shadows. One Avignon pope, Clement VII, was mocked in pamphlets that claimed his mistresses swayed his decisions as much as his cardinals did. Meanwhile, back in Rome, rumours swirled that Boniface IX entertained lovers in chambers draped with tapestries stolen from nobles. Even tavern songs picked sides, mocking one pope's bedroom while praising the others, turning the schism into a bawdy rivalry the entire city sang about. You can almost hear the tune, coarse lyrics echoing through wine-soaked alleys. The debate among historians lingers like smoke. Were these accusations factual, or simply sharpened weapons in a propaganda war? Some scholars argue the charges were slander designed to delegitimize one claimant or another. Others believe that, given the scale of excess at both courts, the rumors likely contained some truth. The uncertainty hums in the air, unresolved, like the echo of two voices shouting across the same throne. The sensory world draws you deeper. You hear the clang of goblets tossed down in anger, the mutter of cardinals scheming, the louder cry of a mistress scorned. You smell roasted meat and wine spilled in frustration, mingling with sweat as factions jostle for power. You touch the heavy fabric of the rival thrones, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each chair warm with the bodies of men who claim to be God's singular vicar, yet shared desires all too human. You reflect on the irony. Schism wasn't simply theological. It was personal, sensual, messy. Rival popes wielded mistresses and lovers as weapons, mocking each other's beds as much as their counsels. To delegitimize an enemy was easy. Just paint him as a man led not by God but by lust. And in this, the papacy fractured not only along political lines, but along the fault lines of scandal. The noise grows sharper, the cries of division, the laughter of satirists, the hissing whispers of enemies at every banquet table. And then, from behind those sounds, comes another echo, higher pitched, more disturbing, the whispers of outrage at popes whose lovers were not only mistresses but shockingly young. You step through the next door, and the chamber ahead feels colder, darker, as though the very walls recoil from what they contain. The chamber you step into now feels colder than any before. The torches burn low, their flames guttering in draughts that carry the faintest sound, high-pitched laughter, nervous, brittle, quickly silenced. You pause, and the silence that follows feels uneasy. This is where the whispers become sharpest, where scandal touches the most fragile edge. The accusations of popes keeping lovers shockingly young, companions whose very presence stoked outrage even among Rome's most jaded gossips. The grounding historical fact steadies you. Pope Julius III, who reigned in the mid-16th century, faced one of the most notorious scandals of the papacy. He elevated a young boy named Innocenzo, barely a teenager, discovered as a beggar near his villa, to the position of cardinal. The relationship between Julius and Innocenzo was so close, so inexplicable by ordinary standards, that enemies immediately suspected something sordid. The promotion outraged the College of Cardinals and scandalized Europe, though Julius persisted in defending his nephew. The quirky tidbit comes in through laughter that was anything but innocent. Satirists across Italy mocked Innocenzo as a puppet, unable to read or write properly, yet walking in crimson robes of the highest office. Some verses jeered that the boy's only qualification was the Pope's fondness for his company. One biting joke compared Innocenzo's illiteracy to his quick learning of other arts, a line that Rome's taverns repeated with drunken glee. You can almost hear the snickers echoing through the city, sharp as broken glass. And still, scholars wrestle with the truth. Was Innocenzo truly the Pope's lover, or merely a companion elevated as an act of paternal affection distorted by rumor? Historians remain split. Some argue that Julius's favor was so blatant, so extravagant, that scandal was inevitable. Others suggest that enemies exploited the oddity of the appointment to invent lurid tales, weaving gossip into history. The debate flickers in the dark, never extinguished, like the wavering torchlight around you. The sensory details weigh heavy here. You smell the musk of sweat trapped in velvet robes, the acrid bite of wax burning too low. You hear the faint creak of wooden benches as cardinals shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another as Innocenzo sat among them, too young, too unfit, yet untouchable. Touch the crimson cloth of a cardinal's seat, it feels plush, luxurious, but tainted, as though the fabric itself resists your hand. You reflect on the paradox. A church that thundered about purity risked its credibility most when youth was involved. It was one thing to keep mistresses, another entirely to parade a boy through the corridors of power. This was scandal with a sharper edge, for it undermined not only holiness, but the very dignity of the papacy. The laughter in the chamber fades, leaving only silence, thick and uncomfortable. You step back, your skin prickling, and realize the next chamber is no less troubling. For behind these walls are murmurs of pregnancies hidden, births concealed, and infants smuggled through corridors at night. You move forward carefully, knowing the air will only grow heavier. The silence of uneasy laughter fades, and now the air grows thick with something more fragile, more desperate. You hear it faintly at first, the muffled cry of an infant, quickly hushed. The sound seems impossible here, echoing off marble walls meant for prayer and governance. Yet it persists, threading through the corridors until you step into a chamber that feels both domestic and clandestine. A cradle sits in the corner, half shrouded by a curtain, while parchment documents lie scattered across a desk, wills, dowries, inheritances hastily drawn up. This is the hidden world of papal pregnancies, where desire left its most undeniable trace. The grounding historical fact steadies you. Several Renaissance popes were widely believed to have fathered children while in office. Pope Innocent VIII openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, arranging marriages for them with noble families. Pope Alexander VI flaunted his offspring, parading Cesare and Lucrezia as instruments of dynastic power. But others were far more secretive. Whispers spread of pregnancies hushed, infants spirited away at night, their very existence denied to protect the fragile dignity of the papal throne. A quirky tidbit flickers in the half-light. During the pontificate of Pope Paul III, it was rumored that women within his circle, nieces, mistresses, even married noblewomen, gave birth to papal children, some of whom were baptized under false names. Chroniclers jested that the Vatican nursery was busier than its libraries, a cruel but memorable barb. In Rome's taverns, ballads joked about babies swaddled in crimson instead of linen. You can almost hear the refrain sung loudly, drunken voices mocking the very idea of holy fathers. But the truth remains murky. Historians argue over which claims of papal children are factual and which are exaggerations or political smears. Some say accusations of secret births were invented to undermine reformist or unpopular popes. Others point to papal land grants, inheritances, and dowry arrangements as evidence that these children existed, though their lineage was carefully disguised. Scholars still puzzle over whether certain infants recorded in noble genealogies were truly papal sons and daughters, or merely convenient fictions. The sensory atmosphere presses close. You smell the faint sourness of milk, the sharp tang of ink spilled across hurried documents. You hear the creak of a rocking cradle, the rustle of silk as a wet nurse shifts nervously, fearful of discovery. Touch the smooth wood of the cradle, polished like altar furniture, yet scarred with tiny scratches where restless hands once gripped. The intimacy of the scene is overwhelming. Holy palaces transformed into makeshift nurseries under the cover of secrecy. You reflect on the danger. For mistresses, a pregnancy could mean elevation or ruin. Some mothers gained influence, using children as leverage for wealth and safety. Others vanished, silenced or dismissed, their infants quietly fostered out. For the popes, the stakes were higher still. Every cry of a newborn was another crack in the illusion of celibacy, another weapon for enemies to wield. The chamber hums with contradictions, innocent life muffled under a blanket of scandal, babies born into both privilege and peril. You close your eyes and hear the lullaby of a nurse, soft and trembling, carrying across the stone like a secret prayer. And as you step away, the cry fades. Ahead, a new sound emerges, the solemn murmur of men debating, voices rehearsing mock trials where morality was publicly performed even as private sins thrived. You're about to enter a theatre of hypocrisy, where justice itself became another stage. The hush of lullabies dies away, and now you step into a chamber that feels staged, theatrical in its solemnity. Rows of benches line the walls, cardinals seated stiffly in crimson, their faces arranged into masks of piety. At the center stands a dais, a parchment unfurled, and a voice rising in measured tones. You realize this isn't true justice, it's performance. These are mock trials of morality, spectacles where the papal court pretended to condemn vice even as it shared in it. The grounding historical fact steadies you. The medieval and Renaissance papacy frequently convened councils and inquiries into clerical immorality, issuing bulls that thundered against concubinage, simony, and corruption. Yet many of the very popes who signed these decrees were notorious for the same sins. Pope Sixtus IV, for instance, railed against sexual immorality among clergy, while his own court was rife with scandal. The paradox was glaring rules imposed with one hand, broken with the other. The quirky tidbit drifts like a mocking echo. Roman satirists once claimed that some papal courts held hearings where courtesans themselves testified not to accuse, but to entertain, their stories twisted into crude comedy. Chroniclers joked about mock confessions staged at banquets, cardinals laughing as women described escapades too scandalous to repeat. Whether real or invented, the image stuck. The Vatican as a stage, its court as both judge and audience. But scholars debate the substance. Were these trials genuine attempts to police clerical morality, or little more than theatre designed to pacify critics? Some argue that disciplinary councils did exist but rarely punished powerful men. Others believe that stories of mock trials were satire, exaggerated to make Rome appear ridiculous. Historians still circle the question, uncertain where performance ended and sincerity began. You let the sensory details close in. You hear the drone of a cardinal reciting charges, his voice monotone, while behind him others stifle yawns. You smell the wax dripping from candles, acrid as it pools on the floor. Touch the parchment, it feels brittle, edges curling from neglect, ink faded as if even the words themselves knew they were hollow. The soundscape shifts as muffled laughter bubbles up from the benches, laughter too irreverent for a court supposedly dedicated to justice. Imagine the scene more vividly. A pope presiding in solemn robes, his face stern, while just the night before he raised a goblet beside the very man now condemned. The irony is so thick it feels suffocating. You reflect on how morality, in this chamber, became less about truth than about appearances. Justice was a costume, worn briefly, discarded when the play was over. The atmosphere feels heavy, stifling. The voices fade, the parchment is rolled up, the candles snuffed. The performance ends, the cardinals retreat to their chambers, and once again nothing has changed. Rome's scandals march on, untouched by empty trials. As you step out, the sound changes. No longer the hollow drone of cardinals, but the rising, lively chatter of streets outside Rome itself, mocking its popes in songs and graffiti. Ahead, the city becomes the stage, its gossip sharper than any papal decree. The solemnity of the mock trial dissolves as you pass through an archway into the open air. Rome itself greets you now lively, restless, and sharp-tongued. The streets are alive with torchlight and chatter, vendors shouting over one another, courtesans leaning from windows, beggars jingling cups. But it's not just commerce that fills the night, it's gossip, unfiltered and merciless. You hear ballads sung in alleys, verses scrawled in charcoal on walls, jokes shouted in taverns, The entire city seems to have turned the Pope's bedroom into its favorite entertainment. The grounding historical fact steadies you. Medieval and Renaissance Rome was notorious for its lampoons of the papacy. Pasquinades, satirical notes and poems were posted on statues like Pasquino near Piazza Navona, where anyone could read mocking verses about popes and their scandals. These public jokes became so common that pasquinate entered the Roman vocabulary as shorthand for biting satire. Papal lusts, mistresses, and bastard children were the city's favourite subject. A quirky tidbit sparkles in the torchlight. During the reign of Alexander VI, one pasquinade mocked him as the bull who mounts all of Rome, a jab at both his family's crest, the bull of the Borgias, and his reputation for excess. Imagine wandering past a statue at dawn, finding that verse pasted to its base, pilgrims chuckling while clerics fumed. The city itself became a gossiping mouth, unafraid to taunt the most powerful man in Christendom. Historians, however, still weigh these verses cautiously. Were pasquinades accurate reflections of papal scandal or exaggerated satire aimed at weakening authority? Some scholars argue they were little more than political cartoons in verse, meant to entertain as much as to expose. Others believe their persistence reveals how deeply the people of Rome believed in the sins they mocked. The truth, as ever, lies somewhere between ink and imagination. The sensory atmosphere envelops you. You hear the strum of lutes in taverns, mingling with drunken choruses of bawdy songs about popes and mistresses. You smell roasted chestnuts from street vendors, their smoke curling into the air above graffiti-smeared walls. You touch the rough stone of a statue, feeling the damp paper of a pasquinade glued to its base, ink still smudging under your fingers. You reflect on the irony. Even as popes thundered from pulpits, condemning the sins of the city turned their hypocrisy into entertainment. Gossip became a weapon sharper than any sword, undermining papal authority not through rebellion but through laughter. Rome laughed, Rome mocked, and Rome remembered. As the songs fade into the distance, you find yourself wandering toward the edge of the city, where the torches burn lower and the streets grow quiet. You step into a courtyard of marble tombs, the air cool and still. Here the laughter is gone, replaced by silence carved in stone. Whispers remain, but now they are etched into monuments, stories hidden in the cracks of marble where desire was buried but never erased. The streets of Rome fade behind you, their songs and lampoons echoing faintly, until you step into a courtyard where the air is still and cool. Moonlight spills across marble tombs, their surfaces gleaming pale, their inscriptions worn soft by centuries of fingers tracing the names of the dead. Here lies the final act, not in taverns or chambers, but in silence carved into stone. You wander among the sepulchres of popes, their epitaphs speaking of holiness and triumph, while the whispers of desire remain unchiseled, hovering like ghosts in the air. The grounding historical fact steadies you. Dozens of medieval and Renaissance popes rest beneath Rome's basilicas, their tombs decorated with Latin inscriptions, praising their virtue, their charity, their defense of the faith. The official record, etched into marble, presents them as saints in all but name. Yet the people who walked past these tombs carried very different memories, gossip that never made it into stone. A quirky tidbit lingers here, carved not in epitaphs but in rumour. Some Romans claim they could still see graffiti scratched faintly onto tombs by irreverent hands, mocking verses that no sculptor dared make official. One tale describes a passerby writing a bawdy couplet on the tomb of a pope known for his mistresses, joking that, "Here lies a father of many, though not of the church." Whether true or not, the image is unforgettable. Marble solemnity defaced by the laughter of the streets. But the scholars still debate. Should we treat these lurid tales as exaggerations, slanders crafted by enemies of Rome? Or do the sheer number of independent accounts, repeated across centuries, suggest that scandal was woven as deeply into the papacy as incense and liturgy? Historians remain divided, their arguments circling endlessly like incense smoke beneath a vaulted ceiling. The sensory atmosphere here is hushed, almost sacred. You feel the chill of marble under your hand, polished, smooth, yet cold as ice. You hear the faint drip of water echoing through the crypt, a reminder of time's patience. You smell the dust of stone mixed with faint traces of candle wax, lingering from vigils held centuries ago. The silence is so deep that even your breath feels intrusive, as though the tombs themselves demand reverence. And yet, as you stand there, the paradox of it all presses in. Beneath these slabs lie men remembered as vicars of Christ, guardians of faith. Yet above their graves, Rome still hums with stories of feasts, lovers, bastards, and sins dressed in silk. The tombs conceal their bodies, but not their reputations. Desire is harder to bury than flesh. You close your eyes, and for a moment you imagine the two worlds overlapping. Marble saints above, whispered scandals below. Holiness and hunger, carved in the same stone. The courtyard grows colder, the moonlight sharper, until even the shadows seem to lean closer, whispering what inscriptions refuse to say. And so the journey ends here, among marble and silence, where the most bizarre sexual practices of medieval popes lie hidden not in archives, not in sermons, but in the unspoken spaces between history and rumour. Now the noise is gone. The drums of feasts, the laughter of courtesans, the cries of children in papal nurseries, all of it fades like smoke into the night. What remains is the stillness of marble, the hush of tombs, and the steady rhythm of your own breath. The story you've drifted through was tangled, scandalous, often unbelievable, yet it was always human. At its heart, it was about desire, messy, insistent, impossible to cage, even beneath the heaviest crown in Christendom. Let the images soften now. No more velvet chambers, no more brothels or banquets. Just a wide, quiet courtyard under the moon, the air cool and clean. You walk slowly across it, your footsteps gentle, each one carrying you farther from the noise of scandal and closer to calm. The stone beneath your feet is firm, steady, grounding. Above, the stars are silent, patient, watching without judgment. Breathe in deeply. The scent of candle wax and old stone is faint, almost comforting. Exhale, and imagine the weight of centuries leaving your shoulders. History is heavy, but tonight you can set it down. Let the voices of gossip, the accusations, the songs, the laughter all drift away like ash on the wind. Feel your body soften, your thoughts loosen. Picture the tombs one last time, not as prisons of scandal, but as quiet resting places. Cool marble, giving way to silence. The contradictions of the past don't need to be solved tonight. They can simply fade, unresolved, into stillness. Now the night is calm again, and so are you. The story closes gently, its edges blurred, its sounds dimmed. Let sleep find you here, in the cool quiet of marble shadows.